Hey there, fellow painters! Have you ever wondered if you could get the same results from a standard brush as you do when using an airbrush for painting fire OSL? Well, neither have I before today. Today's model gives us the unique opportunity to create a side-by-side comparison of these two methods for painting an OSL firelight effect on the same miniature. With this character holding a nearly identical flame on both sides of his body, we will establish the base for the OSL glow on one side of the body using an airbrush, and we will paint the same effect on the opposite side using only a standard brush. And the results may surprise you. I was surprised. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. I like to start with a dark blue coat of spray paint on the rear of the miniature for the base of a blue moonlight or dungeon light glow. On this particular model, I'm doing this to maintain continuity between this model and the rest of the miniatures from this game that all have this aesthetic. If you prefer a standard painted miniature, this step is easily skipped by simply painting the rear of the model with the same colors that we'll use for the front. Before laying down the red base for the fire OSL effect, I'm going to quickly throw down a base coat of the shadow colors for the clothing, hair, and flesh. For the hair and boots, I'm using Hull Red by Vallejo, which is a very dark reddish brown. The coat and flesh will get a coat of German Camo Black Brown. This color is a little dark even for the shadow color of the Ruski's pale skin, so I follow it up with a little orange brown also by Vallejo. I'm laying down these simplified base coats so that the OSL effect interacts more naturally with the different surfaces that it will be illuminating. If we painted the OSL directly over the black primer, it probably wouldn't look right. By the same token, I don't want to continue by highlighting these details with lighter matching hues because I want it to appear that these features are illuminated solely by the firelight. For the white dress shirt, I'm choosing Wolf Gray by the Army Painter. This is a light blue-gray color that will look surprisingly white against the darker colors that it's surrounded by. I'm also leaving any recesses in the shirt untouched. The pants get a quick coat of dark gray Necromancer cloak by the Army Painter. For all of these initial layers of paint, I'm taking the color right up to where it meets the midnight blue spray paint layer on the back side of the miniature. If you're not wanting a blue moonlight effect on the back, simply paint these same colors on the rear of the miniature as well. Now for the OSL comparison. First, I'll point out that I'm using two different paints for this experiment. For the standard brush, I'm using Burnt Red Pro Acryl by Monument Hobbies. And for the airbrush side, I'm using Crimson Acrylic Ink by Daler Rowney. Now you're probably thinking, wait, that's not a fair comparison, they're different colors. Well, I think it is a fair comparison. The reason for this is that the ink through the airbrush is going to be much more translucent than the acrylic burnt red applied with a standard brush. The darker colors that are present under the crimson ink are going to impact the final appearance of the translucent ink, making it appear as dark as the more opaque burnt red. If I thinned out the burnt red enough to feed it through the airbrush, I fear it would appear darker than the burnt red applied alongside it with the standard brush. Anyway, proof is in the pudding. We'll take a look at the model once the red foundation is established on both sides of the model. For the airbrush, I attempt to spray directly from the location of the light source, which is the flame in the character's right hand. This is a general approach, since on a model this small, the sculpt of the flame actually blocks the line of sight between the nozzle of the brush and the area that the flame would be illuminating. What I like about using an airbrush for this effect is that the angle of the airbrush spray automatically highlights the features of the model that would be brightened by this firelight. Using an airbrush is much faster and requires less thought than manually picking out all of the highlighted areas with a standard brush. For the glow on the miniature's left side, I start with a very small dry brush and some burnt red. This is great for hitting some edge highlights and mapping out the area where I want the firelight to be more prominent. As I proceed though, I need to switch to a size 1 round brush to refine the details. This is particularly important on the smoother features such as the forehead, lapel, and small folds in the coat breast. In fact, I also used this round brush to refine the red highlights on the model's upper right arm where I had difficulty aiming the airbrush at the appropriate angle. So that's definitely a perk of using a standard brush in that I have more control over the placement of the highlights than when using an airbrush. Now that both sides are done, the finished appearance looks incredibly similar. The one noticeable difference is how much shinier the acrylic ink side looks, but this will be remedied in the following steps. Before I continue with the OSL, I want to get a nice solid layer of matte white on the two flames. I'm going to paint the fire with some very translucent acrylic paints and fluorescent inks, so this solid white foundation will really make the fire shine. I want to make sure to get some fine white lines between the fingers as well so that it appears that the glow is creeping through the cracks in the fingers. The first color that I use to build towards the final OSL glow is Clear Orange by Vallejo. Because this paint is pretty translucent to start, I don't have to thin it as much with water to neatly glaze the layers into place. As I build these layers, I focus on achieving greater opacity on the edges and prominent folds in the cloth. I almost exclusively draw my strokes toward the light source so that we get a natural buildup of color intensity as we get closer to the flame. More paint will be deposited at the end of the stroke than at the beginning, so this is a simple technique to employ in order to pull off convincing highlights. I continue to add layers that will each cover a little less area than the previous layer until I produce a solid orange layer nearest the light source. Next, I add some ice yellow to the clear orange and continue the same pattern as before. This mix requires a little more thinning because of how opaque the ice yellow is. Clear orange and ice yellow are the only two additional colors that I'm using on top of the red for this object source lighting. I feel it's important to use desaturated versions of the colors that make up the light source when painting the light that is cast onto surrounding objects. Since I'm going to use bright yellow, orange, and red to paint the flames, I want to use colors that are less intense when painting the objects illuminated by that flame. I don't want the OSL to be a mirror image of the colors used in the flame. As I paint this, I will add a little more ice yellow to the mix before moving on to ice yellow on its own. The final step for the OSL glow is to apply pure ice yellow to just the shiniest features upon which the firelight is cast. This means that just the skin and hair will receive a small amount of ice yellow highlights. The dual light source means that we will highlight both sides of the miniature almost perfectly symmetrically. This is unusual for my approach to painting, as I generally like the model to be highlighted on just one side while the opposite side has some deeper shadows. To adjust for this, I want the lower half of the miniature to receive minimal highlights. I want to do some wet blending for the colors in the flames, so I'm going to simultaneously mix up 3 pots of paint, one red, one orange, and one yellow. Each color will consist of 1 drop of bright acrylic paint, 1 drop of fluorescent acrylic ink, and 1 drop of flow improver. As I layer these paints on the model, I avoid getting the paint into the deepest recesses, particularly on the lower part of the flames. I want the internal crevices of the flames to appear as the hottest and therefore the brightest part of the fire, so they'll remain a little white for now. I take the yellow a little higher on each flame than it will be in the final scheme, but this is so that as I apply the orange, I can blend it into the yellow. I continue to leave a little white showing in the crevices of the orange area, and I take the orange all the way to the end of the flame tips. Then I work the red into the orange flames just near the tip of the flames. Once these 3 colors are all in place, I use some pure fluorescent yellow ink to fill in the white spaces on the lower half of the flames and in between the fingers to make them appear as the hottest points within the fire. I work pure fluorescent orange into the upper portion of the flames, freely brushing it over some of the red areas to make them appear brighter. Then I use the original red mixture to brighten the red flame tips. Finally, I slightly thin down some of the fluorescent orange ink and glaze it over all of the OSL areas on the character's head, face, and clothing to make it pop a little more. This will also reduce some of the chalkiness that can be present when using nearly white paints, such as ice yellow. The final step for the flames is to just touch the ends of the flames with a little Agrax Earthshade to make it look like the flames are becoming smoky at the very tips. Before I share my final thoughts on the airbrush versus standard brush approach to OSL, we have a couple of areas to highlight on the clothing. Rasputin's overcoat will get a little highlight of chocolate brown just along the front of the jacket running from the lower button down. We aren't going to get crazy with the highlights because we want the firelight glow around the face and head to be the focal point for this piece. Then we'll use some leather brown to add brighter highlights to a reduced area on the jacket breast and begin adding some edge highlights to the lapel. We'll also use this color to highlight the tops of the shoes. Only the jacket will receive some additional highlights that are brighter using some ochre brown. This is added just to the edges and is used to accentuate the buttons on the jacket. We keep the pant highlights super simple by merely edge highlighting the folds and creases in the pants with some uniform gray by the Army Painter. Finally, we wrap up the project by adding a quick little backlight glow to the rear of the miniature. For this, I'm using Azure by Vallejo to give the midnight blue spray paint a moonlit appearance. I still want the miniature to look like it's mostly in the dark, illuminated primarily by his flaming hands, so I'm keeping the highlights very light and simple. When it's all said and done, the OSL effect on both sides of the model looked very similar. The airbrush side was faster and easier to achieve, even when taking into consideration the extra time spent refining some of it with a standard brush. With an OSL effect this small, the standard brush really didn't take that much longer, and it means I wouldn't have to set up and subsequently clean an airbrush. It was honestly just as easy to use the standard brush as it was to use the airbrush. I think for larger OSL projects, like what I did with Hulk or Cthulhu, I would prefer to use an airbrush to establish the base for the OSL glow. But for small projects like this little fire effect, I was really blown away by how easy it is to accomplish a nice OSL base with a standard brush. What do you think? Are you pro airbrush or pro paintbrush for OSL work? Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.